There's a little something I've wanted to talk about for a little bit now, or perhaps it might be more accurate to say that I've had something of a realization about the relationship between, at least insofar as I can make sense of it, the players, the DM's approach to creation, and the desired outcome of the players at the table. It started when I was reflecting on something a player did in my game, which, without boring anyone watching the video, I'll simply say was them attempting to trick an NPC with a pretty creative and interesting use of a spell, but which ultimately backfired, leading to the loss of their most valued magic item. Not that this is something that matters, but what's interesting I think is that in the aftermath of the situation, my player said to me that they'd wished maybe I'd taken a second to give them some forewarning that what they were doing wasn't destined for anything good. But as much as that was the case, they hadn't wanted to tell me about their plan before the session because they become jaded by watching other DMs and how they might have connived or whatever against the players in this situation. And part of my reaction was to think about the overemphasis that advice-giving D&D content creators put on such topics as red flags which indicate your DM's a dick cheese or the multitude of D&D horror stories.
I think the neutral evil DM is characterized by pretending to be one of the other alignments and then gaslighting you when you call them on it.
But today I realised, or at least I think I realised, and certainly don't want to have this perspective broken by checking with my aforementioned player, that his decision not to tell me his plan in advance was not just, or even so much, about thinking that I would screw him over, after all we're good mates, but more a question of wanting his plan to be real. My first real experience of RPGs, with a capital R in the meaning of the term, came with Fable 2. No game before had given me that same experience of meaningful transformation. In this moment I'm thinking of the decision you can make to save or not the village of Oakfield. Upon choosing to ignore or complete a certain quest, completely aside from and even divorced from your ultimate ability to complete the main quest line, the little town of Oakfield rests. That decision lives forever in the reality of the game, or experience or save or whatever you wish to call it. The spire will fall no matter what, but Oakfield will never be there again, or alive, because of you. And if you're willing to take that extra little leap of faith where you grant, because you choose to, that this is a matter of fact for this world that you've played through, then you're confronted with something much better than consequence. You're confronted with tangible, meaningful effect. So bringing it back to what I was discussing before, I think it wasn't just that my player, in not speaking to me about their plans beforehand, wanted what they were doing to succeed, but they wanted it to succeed in the world, where I stood by as an adjudicator of the reality to which they were presented, not a phantom who can bend reality to a shape of which I might desire. If my player had come to me, then yeah, I could have screwed him over. Or alternatively, I could have changed the circumstances such that his plan would succeed. And in either case, the outcome would have been unsatisfying. My player wasn't looking to be told they succeeded, or told how much I loved their creative approach and that I was willing to let it be. No. I suspect that what they wanted was for their ingenuity to transform the reality of that moment, in which they could be assured of the actuality that their decision, their plan, their power as the character in that moment was the force that transformed the world. When you consider this, you can see what is given and taken away by the tabletop. In the case of the video game, you have a constrained certainty. I can reload the game and make the opposite decision, I can watch other playthroughs, and I can know, therefore, that my decision wasn't an illusion granted to me by a well-meaning DM. No, I will in that moment. And I can say without equivocation that I mattered in the fate of that place. However, this comes at a cost. For all the definitive knowledge one gains of their power to affect in Fable, the extent of that impact is always limited by the possibilities of coding. This is one of the reasons why Telltale games are, for lack of a better word, sort of pointless. When you can release a sequel which, regardless of every decision you've made before, plays out in the exact same manner for every other player, then what's the point of the decisions, which form nothing more than a droplet in a bucket of determinism? Whereas D&D gives to us infinite complexity, Like a tree growing new branches, each session reprograms the game in the image of one's actions, at first in minute details, being weighed against the structure of forces given to the world, stuff like factions, geography, gods. But as the game progresses and each step folds into the next, each imprint growing wider with the player's political and level-given influence, one eventually sees the ultimate force of the player in and against the world. I remember watching Brennan Lee Mulligan once joking about his players' desire to know about whether or not a certain aspect of his dungeon had existed before the players had stepped into it, and quipping that it didn't really matter that he had created a monster on the other side of the door, while covered in, I want to say, Cheez-Its, a few days before the session, changing the reality of what was to come. Now, every player knows that preparation can only take you so far, but there is, I would say, a distinction between two forms of approaching DMing, for those of us who aren't omniscient, and these are called the authentic and the chaotic. The world of our creation is given to the players as definitive, but to the DM, it operates much more like a shadow waiting to take form. If my player asks me to detail the contents of a village, I can peruse my notes and talk about the magic shop, the temple, the lord or council, and the numerous more or less important peoples and factions that constitute the organism of the town. But if the rogue or wizard, having become interested in, say, the magic shop, all of a sudden declares they want to slide on in and burglarize the place, is it to detract from the actuality of its contents if I estimate what's in there? Or, even if the player had told me the day before the session they wanted to do something like this, would that introduction of a new object, however small, warp the reality of the world in a way which is not but the grubby meta hands of a DM rebuilding the world they've made? I would say, on the contrary, if one is willing, one can state that, although before entering and asking the DM, it isn't that the store didn't contain anything. How else could it be described as such? Rather, the store always had that content, but before the question was asked, in the minds of all those of us creating it, the DM and the players, the store existed just as a universal representation, a sign, a sigil, an identity. But now it's a thing, a this, something definitive and idiosyncratic, a particular unto itself, which is not just magically manifested by the DM, but is finally given form to all those who observe it. Through this lens, DMing can be understood as much as the mastery of deduction as it is storytelling. The players want you to honestly tell them how the world and the forces which shape it would actually react to their being there, and the decisions they make therein. It's not about creating wacky or challenging encounters per se, though of course, that's an aspect of all good games. But try as you might, it's unlikely that your description or encounter generation is ever going to be equal to something that you can find in a book, game, or movie. But the essence of D&D, insofar as it stands alone in this process of control within immersion, is selfhood reflected in the genuine actions of the other existing in the world. Now, this isn't to say that one shouldn't emphasize the transformative ability of one NPC, who, like the players, manifest their shadow within the world rapidly and of their own initiative. The world shouldn't simply feel like tectonic plates taking the form of kings and empires, living to revolve and act in response to these people. But what I'm trying to underline is that insofar as there is a world which one can grasp and internalize, it has to breathe in a way which isn't born of convenience for the DM, but of itself. This is why I would say it's fine to maintain this authenticity while simultaneously implanting things in the world as players act within it, such as new dungeons, new factions, familial ties, or even changes in plot or central tension, or whatever entity appears as hard and eternal to the players as anything you can imagine. This is because, in the process of playing, you'll discover what should have always been there, and not until the world began turning did you discover what makes it spin, often as a direct reaction to what the players themselves had done or wondered. That is, after all, the nature of collaborative storytelling, even if it's more like clay in one writer's hands than in another. And this is so far removed from the type of DMing which creates things solely for theatrical effect, or even worse, simply to mess with the players as they go on. Always remember, it's one thing to feel as if the world's fun, and another to feel if it's real, but better still for it to be real. And I'll end by demonstrating this, at least I hope, by pointing to one clear thing. It's often the case that well-meaning DMs will, when their players do something which endangers their well-laid plans, intervene. Like say when a party member commits a crime which would see them exorcised from the city, or when they challenge someone who really might kill a PC in that moment. The DM here will attempt to remove the players from the situation, or make the law into bumbling idiots, or change that NPC who could kill them into just another hobo. But players will tell you, often and maybe with half an inch of regret that they're doing so, that what they really want is consequence. And the reason that's given is often about wanting to preserve suspense, threat, and though I think this is true, I think all players understand that if they can't do anything wrong, then they can't do anything other than what the DM wanted, and as such they're just players on his stage. But for you to be in the world, it has to have its own autonomy, its own rules, and ability to act as it sees fit. And only through this consistent application of cost to anyone can the players know that they're not just simply players, but another person in the world, in the eyes of the world, and as such everything they do is, if you're willing to grant it, radically real.